our children have stored information over in the one hemisphere on like how to fold clothing and put it away. It's there maybe, but they can't get to it in all the moments that we need them to.
Yeah.
And so just because they folded the laundry today and put it away in their drawers doesn't mean that they can tomorrow.
Well, hey, Barb Clark. We're so thankful to have you this morning.
Hi, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. Man, you have such a broad wealth of experience and so many angles from the content that we try to offer our audience and our listeners. So it's just going to be really fun to talk to you today, and we're just really, really thankful.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's always fun to be able to share with our community.
Absolutely. And amen to that. So thank you for taking a minute to jump on with us. And so we love to start off with just kind of a random question. And just because we love to get to know our folks as people, we're professionals, but we're also people. So mountains or beach?
I struggled with that question because I love them both, but I'm going to have to go with beach. I am kind of a bit of a sun bum. I live in Florida. I moved here 2.5 years ago from Minnesota for the beaches, so I got to go with beach.
Oh, I love that. Okay, what beach is your favorite in Florida?
Oh, it's kind of a tiny unknown beach that's in the community that I live in. I don't like to share the name of it because I don't like it to get overcrowded. But it's kind of a local community beach. But the bummer is for the second year in a row now, it is closed from hurricane damage. So.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So I have to drive an hour away to go to a beach now to like Clearwater or St. Pete area.
Well, my answer is mountains. And I love that you've made strategic choices in your life to live near beaches. And I don't know that we made the strategic choice to live in the mountains, but we don't hate it. We love it.
Yep. Sounds lovely.
As you can tell by my pasty white complexion, I don't make it to very many beaches, but all the respect for that. And I would say most people in my life prefer beaches over mountains. So I don't know what that says about me, but here we are. Okay, so beyond all of that, we would love just a little background on you, your work, yourself, fun facts about you, anything that you would love to share.
Well, as I said, I'm a Minnesotan. Most people can hear it in my accent, don't you know? I got quite the Norwegian accent.
Love that.
I grew up in a kind of a middle-sized town in the middle of Minnesota, and I actually have a somewhat famous mother in the women's rights movement. She's been portrayed and made for TV movie on NBC and PBS documentaries and stuff. She was a part of a group of 8 women called the Wilmer 8 who went on strike back in 1978 for unfair labor practices. And they were on 60 Minutes and all these different things and kind of helped to move, helped to shift kind of the landscape for women in the workplace back in the 70s. So that's kind of one of my claim to fames. But I ended up living in the Twin Cities of Minnesota in the Minneapolis area after that's where I went to college at the University of Minnesota and lived there until 2.5 years ago when we moved to Florida. My first profession, I went to the U of M, University of Minnesota, for youth development. And so I was a youth worker. I managed youth centers and youth programs in schools and nonprofits and stuff. And I worked with a huge variety of young people, but I worked with a lot of at-risk teenagers in some of the youth centers and programming I used to work with. And, I love all kids, but I prefer teenagers, which is rare. Most people prefer the smaller children. You put me in a room with 30 younger kids and my skin crawls, but you put me in a room with teenagers who might be cussing at me or having some interesting behaviors, and that's my jam. I love that. And so
Awesome.
I never thought I would find a profession that I was better at or enjoyed personally, and more than what I did as, working in the youth development field. But when we started our family in 1999 through adoption, my world kind of changed. My whole world perspective and world, like everything, ended up eventually changing from that experience. And I eventually, as our kids were growing older and stuff like that, kind of ended up starting to work in the child welfare field and kind of found my home there. So we adopted 4 children. We got a new infant every year in a row for 4 years. And so our kids right now are 22, 23, 24, and 25. And we have kind of picked up an additional one that we call our fictive kin placement. It's actually my oldest daughter's boyfriend who wants us to adopt him. But we clearly can't because they've been dating for 7 or 8 years. And so, but he basically is our son and he calls us mom and dad. And so we claim him now as our 5th child.
Oh, that's awesome. Mm-hmm. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Wow. So do you get the question like we do in our family, wow, 4 kids in a row, that sounds really hard on your body. And you're like, well, my brain maybe, but.
Yeah. Yep. Was harder on the brain and the emotional state and all of that kind of stuff in those early years. Eventually, I did find it was harder on the body too.
Yeah, exactly.
Just the stress that the body takes. But yes, people all the time, a lot of times before they knew that we were an adoptive family would say things like that all the time. And I'm like, yep, well, didn't have to experience that part of it, the physical aspect. But yeah. And when I kind of started working in this area, I first started working at an organization in Minnesota called Proof Alliance, which they used to be called the Minnesota Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. But I was a family resource coordinator there. I provided training, but support for families. I did that for a couple of years. And now for the last about 9 years, I've been at an organization called Families Rising, which we also have a new name for about a year now. Our former name was the North American Council on Adoptable Children. And I'm the director of training there. And so I provide and kind of manage the training that we provide around the United States and Canada within the kind of child welfare arena. So we'll do, the main thing I train on the most is fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because that's my area of specialty. But we also train on many other topics: transracial parenting, grief and loss, self-care, how to lead support groups, technology safety with the trauma lens, launching adults. Like, we just have tons of different trainings that we provide, virtually and in person all over North America.
Barb, I loved hearing some of your mom's story. And I honestly believe that you are part of shifting the landscape for the kids in our world who need people in their world to understand trauma and how it impacts us. And so as you were saying that your mom was shifting the landscape for, against unfair labor practices, I love that you have taken that, baton, that banner, and have taken it into completely different but absolutely vital space. And I'm not sure if your mom is still with you, able to see all of that, but I'm sure that she's so proud of you.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. She passed away actually 20 years ago this week.
Wow.
But I was just in Iowa in November with a lot of my extended family, cousins and aunts and uncles, and a couple of my cousins and I were having a conversation and talking about how in some ways, what I'm doing, it is kind of stemming from my mom's legacy of standing up for what's right and kind of trying to promote goodness in this world. And that is one of my missions within child welfare and just in general, just for people to be more trauma responsive, trauma informed, and also more fetal alcohol spectrum disorder kind of knowledgeable.
Absolutely. You're giving voice to kids and families that absolutely may not even have words for a lot of this.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite part of offering voice for kids and families?
My favorite part is when I can see, so, one of the things that I struggled with in parenting our children was that we were using typical parenting strategies, right? Almost all of us in our society were parented with punitive, consequence-based, logic-based parenting. And what we experienced is that doesn't work great with a lot of kids, and actually the majority of kids who have experienced trauma. And so we made a lot of mistakes. And so I say this all the time, and I think it's even in my bio, my professional bio, is that I want to help other people not make the same mistakes that we made, whether you're a caregiver or a professional, because even in my professional work before I worked in child welfare, when I worked with young people, I can now look back and see so many things I did and said to the young people and their parents, their caregivers, that was inaccurate and not helpful and probably even harmful. And so my goal is really just to help people make less mistakes. And so for me, the most rewarding thing is when I can see some caregivers kind of switch their paradigm, and what we see most of the time when we're able to work with providing the right training and support and knowledge and understanding for families and professionals, we can see the children and the adolescents start to have more satisfaction. We can see behaviors decrease, and we can see more family harmony. And like one of my biggest goals is for improved relationships between the caregivers and the children that they're caring for, because in particular for some of our children who have some of these challenging and tough behaviors, we can just see this huge kind of toxicity that can kind of overwhelm a family. And so when I can see through training and the right support, I can see them starting to shift and do things differently, and I can see more harmony within a family. That makes all the difference in the world to me.
That's amazing. And for our audience and our listeners, we're not just talking about adoptive and foster families. We're talking about there's just millions of us that have experienced trauma in different ways, and we can define trauma a lot of different ways, but really for our purposes and for today, we're talking about really any mental health challenge that we could face, either individually or as a family, children, adults, teenagers. And so I think it's really easy for us to kind of, feel like, oh, I made so many mistakes and I wish I'd known that. And of course,
yes,
true for me, 100%. But also, I feel like this is an innovative field. And so in some ways, to, parents out there that are feeling like, gosh, I wish I knew this 10 years ago.
Yes.
This is an evolving, innovative field.
Yes.
And because of that, we're all learning. We look back on medical practices that took place 50 years ago. We're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. Or in the Civil War, they used to, have to solve simple issues by, taking off a limb. Well, now we think that's crazy. Like we would never do that.
Right.
Now we understand a whole lot more about medicine. And then the same is becoming more true about mental health issues. And so,
yes,
I want to give us all permission and space to be learners in the process. And I think the challenge is when we're not even aware that that the trauma that we've experienced or the trauma that our kids have experienced actually does spill out onto our floor. And we do need to do something about it. That's sometimes where the rub, comes. And so I know some of our work involves just educating people no, that reaction that you're having, that's something for us to kind of step back from a second and say, why am I feeling this? Why is this coming to mind? So yeah, I love that you're right there in the innovation of this field. And I love that your focus is FASD, which, as we said, is Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. And it just affects so many more people than we ever thought. There are so many adults my age, from 30 to 100 that are walking around and face certain challenges their whole lives. And they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. So
yeah,
again,
absolutely.
A very innovative field. So what are some of the new things that just even in the last last year or so, that we're learning about FASD and, ways to come alongside?
Oh, there's so much. There's, the prevalence rates, which are almost 5 years old now, I think, or maybe are 5 or 6 years old now, but are 1 out of 20 here in the United States. And that's in the general population, right? The general population, 1 out of 20. And even the researchers have admitted they think it's much higher than that. And the diagnosis is almost always missed. I know, like in that research that Dr. Philip May was the lead researcher on, this research with the 1 out of 20, and I can't remember, it was something like 6,000 some children that they researched, and at the end of the research, 222 of them were diagnosed with an FASD, but when they started it, only 2 of those 222 were properly diagnosed.
Wow.
So the diagnosis is almost always missed. I know that some of Dr. Ira Chasnoff's research has shown that in the foster care and adoption kind of world, that the diagnosis is missed 86.5% of the time. So, again, it's pretty high in the general population, and it's higher within adoption, foster, and kinship care. There aren't any real current specific research, models on that. There's estimations that somewhere around 70% or 80% of children, for example, who are in foster care were likely prenatally exposed. And so it's pretty high. There's also some research that's coming out, and it's still not quite, there isn't enough on it, but there's also research where they're looking at the father's alcohol use and the impact that might have on diagnostics.
Wow, interesting.
And disability. And so 10 years ago, the answer that was always said was, no, the father's drinking doesn't have an impact. But now they actually think that it does. Currently, it does not lead to a diagnosis. Diagnostics for FASD are very complicated, and especially here in the United States, they do a better job in Canada of making it less complicated, but it is pretty complicated here. And one of the biggest challenges that we have in the FASD world is just lack of professionals that have the right understanding and knowledge and training on FASD. Even literally people who are graduating medical school, social work school, teacher school today are still not getting the right information, which is a really frustrating thing to our FASD community.
And, let's be honest, how much of that misdiagnosis or lack of any sort of even going to seek a diagnosis or, any of that, how much of that is based out of shame? Either because we're the biological parent and we are fearful of what that diagnosis means for us or says about us. And then you've got the adoption foster community, we just want to move forward. We don't want to, like that kind of thing. Like how much of this is shame-based?
Oh, there's so much shame-based with this. This is something I struggle with too. There's also, a thing that I see really common within our adoptive, foster, and kinship families is anger and blame towards the biological family, towards the first family, and again, any diagnosis that an individual receives, there's always grief and loss that comes with that the individual and their family are going to have to deal with. And anger is one of the aspects of grief.
Sure.
We just don't want to get stuck there. That's what I see too many families being stuck in, that finger pointing and blame. What I always say is that no parent ever does this intentionally, right? They're not using alcohol or drugs to harm their children. They're either struggling with a substance use disorder, they had an unplanned pregnancy and then stopped, but maybe the damage had already occurred, or they, just received the wrong information. There are still doctors, OBGYNs, telling pregnant women that it is okay to use alcohol moderately during pregnancy, which is completely not correct. And, and people will say this. I was just doing a training on FASD yesterday for an organization, and a lady who was, in her 60s, was like, well, everybody drank, my mom drank, everybody drank back then. Why wasn't it a problem back then? And I'm like, oh, it was, but it's just different. And again, I was born in the 60s. My mother did use alcohol socially on the weekends. I know enough about it to know that it impacted me. I actually just finished writing a book about 3 or 4 weeks ago that'll come out next fall. And I even talk about that. And I talk about the fact that I was exposed, and I know I am on the spectrum. I haven't gone in for diagnostics, but I have ADHD extremely. I struggle with math and science big time. I had to have changed my major multiple times to avoid certain classes that just wouldn't work for my brain. I have significant sleep issues. I have some quirky, weird medical stuff. I struggle with the brain function of crossing the midline. So there's a lot of people like me who were able to function in society, but it took potential away. And that's what it can do. That's what it almost always is going to take potential away when there is alcohol exposure, but it's not always going to end up in super extreme challenges. Like my daughter, my children were all prenatally exposed to alcohol, and anything that I ever share, whether on a podcast, in a training, when I'm speaking, I have permission from my children to share. So it's important to know that.
Yes, thank you.
And so Akila is my one who was diagnosed with FASD, but they were all impacted and lost potential from it, as did I. And so it's just important that we know that. I also had protective factors too, right? So my mother was using alcohol on the weekends socially, but she also had good nutrition. And so nutrition plays a factor into it. If the mother's levels of betaine, iron, choline, there's 4 or 5 different substances that they've found in research. If they had high levels of that, the damage was not as severe to the fetus, to their brain. And so, I also didn't experience other traumas, which many of our children that are coming into adoptive and foster, families, there was also some intergenerational trauma, other trauma that they experienced maybe in utero, and then also maybe in early life. So that's what we see as the impact can be just really different because there's so many factors that go into it.
Wow. So for you, has this diagnosis, I don't know if it's an official diagnosis for you, but for you, has this brought, I'm sure it's the whole grief process, Kubler-Ross for days, right? But are you in a space of I'm so glad I feel free now because now I feel like so many things have been explained.
Oh, I definitely, I remember, it's so funny. I literally was training on FASD, working in the field for probably a couple of years before I was like, wait, and my mother had already passed away, but I knew, but when she actually, the year that Akila was diagnosed, when Akila was 6, was the year that my mother died. And I had started bringing the conversation up a little bit, and she was like, well, I drank when I was pregnant with you, but it didn't kind of hit me until a couple of years, later when I was like, as I started to learn more about what the symptoms are, where the struggles can be, and I was like, wait, I got a lot of these struggles, right? And so, it was kind of a little bit of okay, now I understand why that is. And to be honest, a lot of the families that I work with, when their children are diagnosed, they're always really hesitant and concerned about, should I tell my child? Because, and again, because you were talking about this earlier, Meredith, about that shame factor, right? And this is the most shame-filled diagnosis out there because we know what causes it, we know how to prevent it, and we love to point our finger and blame the people that use the alcohol. And so, and that does nobody any good. And
Right.
it actually, what happens is it actually prevents our children, whether they're children, adolescents, or even adults, from getting the proper supports because of that stigma that's out there. And so I actually advocate for immediately, the caregivers, the family need to wrap their head around the diagnosis and learn about it and get prepared and then share it with the child, even if they're 6 or 4 or 10 or 15 or 40. And what we hear the majority of the time from individuals, who found out that they had an FASD, the majority of the time, once they go through those stages of grief and loss, it's relief. It's relief of, I'm not just dumb. Because often what we will hear from a lot of these kids is they always felt dumb or stupid or whatever language is that they're using. And we're like, you're absolutely not. You just have a brain injury, an organic kind of hidden brain injury. And really, it looks like willful disobedience. It looks like kids making bad choices. And we assume it's bad choices because they were able to do it today. Why can't they do it tomorrow?
Oh my gosh,
So that is
yes.
what makes us assume that this was just a bad choice. But that is directly related to some of the brain injury that they have. It's the corpus callosum. The damage to that part of the brain is what leads them to be incredibly inconsistent.
And the corpus callosum, for our listeners that may not know, is that connection between one side of our brain to the other. And so when we talk about difficulty crossing midline, that's what we're talking about, is the challenge of integration in our brain.
Yes. Yes, exactly. It's sometimes called like the highway or the telephone for our brain because it helps those two hemispheres to communicate. And what happens often is our children have stored information over in the one hemisphere on like how to fold clothing and put it away. It's there maybe, but they can't get to it in all the moments that we need them to.
Yeah.
And so just because they folded the laundry today and put it away in their drawers doesn't mean that they can tomorrow.
I used to kind of think about it, and this is non-diagnostic and non-official and non-scientific, but just the Schumann way or the Meredith way is that sometimes I would sense that it felt like emotion was wrapping around my kids' brains. And so we could be studying for a test and they could just be nailing it like, oh man, this is great. You're killing it. This is awesome.
Yes.
And then the day of the test, stress or some outside whatever is coming in and the emotion then becomes an actual barrier to this information that's literally sitting in their brain.
There. Oh, absolutely. And you're right. It is stress related. It is anxiety. I talk about anxiety a lot. You know, all of us have experienced anxiety. It might be giving a speech in front of a group of people, a job interview, driving through the snowy mountains in a snowstorm, right? We've all experienced it. Some of us might have generalized anxiety disorder that's diagnosable, but we've all experienced it. And I talk about this too. Like sometimes if you're driving down the highway and all of a sudden the red flashing lights are in the rearview mirror and you have that, oh, nuts, I'm getting pulled over moment. And, you know, we kind of have this hot flash of anxiety that goes through our body. And because when we're anxious, our heart starts to beat faster, which is what increases our body temperature and makes people pit out and sweat. You know, our blood sugar increases, our blood pressure increases, and our bodies tense up. And so, you know, when we're driving down the highway and then we see those red flashing lights and we think we're maybe getting pulled over for speeding or whatever, and then they drive past us and we're like, right, we can like take a deep breath and breathe easy, but it still is going to take probably at least 30 minutes for our bodies to completely regulate from that hot 30 to 60 minute hot flash of anxiety. And so if we think about a moment like that and think about our children and that many of our kids who have trauma histories wake up feeling like that and go to bed feeling like that and sleep feeling like that. Some of them, they feel like that the entire 6.5, 7 hours they're at school. Some of them, they're not like that at school and that's how they feel at home, you know, but it's all over the map. So we really have to, you know, be cognizant of the anxiety and how that is impacting our kids, because it is one of the biggest culprits to the tough behaviors that we're seeing.
Absolutely. A lot of the ways that we think about it are, you know, there's calm brain, alert brain, and fear brain. And, you know, we talk about it, you know, clinically as these 3 stages. And, you know, we go from here to here and we talk about fear brain as being something, you know, like more like uncommon in a typical day. But you're absolutely right. For a lot of the kids in our homes and that we serve, and many of us as adults, teenagers included, we could spend all day in fear brain. We could wake up in the morning, we're in fear brain, good morning, you know, whereas that blood is shunted to the back of our brain and we just don't have as much access to those logical, you know, prefrontal cortex. So yeah, I love that you're bringing that up.
Well, and this is what, you know, I say this to families a lot, and I have to say this actually to the staff. So Akila, my daughter, who's 25 and has FASD, she lives in a group home in Minnesota. And, you know, I have to say this to her staff fairly often too. I'm like, so I'll always ask them, like, how are her manners when she's like in a good mood and when her brain is online and not buffering or offline, how are her manners and how is she to be around? And they're like, oh, she has amazing manners. She has great manners. And I'm like, okay, so anytime that she's being rude or disrespectful, that is your immediate message to know that her anxiety is off the charts.
Yeah.
Because that is not a typical behavior for her when everything is going smooth inside of her. And so that is your immediate cue to back off, become very, non-confrontational, to be supportive and connected and to listen. And don't argue and don't use logic in those moments, right?
Absolutely.
And, I have to say that to a lot of the families that I work with all the time too. You have to just immediately know when they are getting escalated or being rude or whatever it is. That is your immediate cue to stop what you are doing and saying and stop talking a whole bunch.
Right. It's so common for us, and I've done this so many times, when you sense someone around you becoming agitated or stressed or anxious, we want to talk you through it. Like, we want to say, you're fine, you're safe, you're loved, I'm here for you, blah, blah, blah. And those are all true things.
Yes.
But if they're logical and logic-based, they may not even be able to hear what you're saying and process it.
Oh, exactly. I talk about that all the time. Most children who have fetal alcohol, but even just other kind of trauma histories, have auditory processing deficits. And so even when their brains are online, their brains process more slowly the words that they are hearing.
Right.
When they are in the yellow zone of dysregulation or the red zone, and in the alert brain, all that stuff, it's almost non-existent. And it's like they're hearing every 15th, 20th word you're saying. And so the more we keep talking, thinking that we are being helpful in those moments, the more we are keeping their brain working at a point where it can't slow down to use a calming strategy that they've learned in probably umpteen therapy sessions that they've had.
Right. Calming strategies like breathing. There's just like all these fun little exercises you can do with kids or with adults that are regulation for breathing. There's parasympathetic pressure points, like, right?
Yes.
I'm pressing on, just below my nose, above my lip. There's a lot of options out there. If our listeners don't know, some of those regulation techniques, we have some of that content on our social media. I'm sure you guys do too. But yes, many times, and let's face it, I mean, I get there. I'm in fear brain from time to time.
Yes.
And what I would love for people to do for me is say, hey, would you breathe with me I would like to invite you. Would you breathe with me?
Yeah.
Because it's not saying you need to breathe and you got a problem. It's saying, you know what? I'm feeling the stress in the matter and I probably need to breathe just like you do.
Absolutely. And what we have to be so mindful of too, though, is each individual child or adolescent is going to be different. Like, my daughter literally would tell me to go, F myself. I said, let's breathe right now. If I caught her at the very beginning of the yellow zone, that might work. But once they're usually halfway through the yellow zone or in the red zone, those strategies that they've been learning in lots of different sessions are usually, for sure, once they're in the red zone, it's nope, don't be suggesting most of those strategies for most of the kids. But in the yellow zone, sometimes those are going to work. But we just have to be mindful for every child is going to be different with that. Because, again, some of our kids, telling them to get a stress ball and squeeze it might just trigger them.
It's just such a moving target too, depending on...
It is.
Oh, all the sensory things. There's just so much going on in all of us. So we've talked some about FASD. We've talked some about trauma and mental health challenges. Say I'm a neighbor or I go to church with a family whose kids have what we could call big behaviors, right?
Yes.
And I think sometimes if I'm, kind of seeing something going on, or I've heard of, this family has these kind of big behaviors in their house, it would be natural for us to kind of pull away and say, oh, well, I'll let them handle that, or I'll let them reach out when they're ready. And I know that probably logically sounds caring and loving, but what are some actual strategies that any of us can, if we know there's a family that we're in relationship with, church, neighborhood, school,
Yep.
whatever,
Help.
with kids that have big behaviors, like how can we come alongside them practically?
Oh, yeah. What I always recommend, no matter what it is that somebody wants to potentially help somebody else with, is don't say, I don't like let me know if there's anything I can do.
Yep.
That's so vague, and everybody's just like, okay, that's just one of those things that it's rare that anybody ever asks you for help when you say that. So you have to, what I always do is I would say to a family that I knew, here's 2 things I can do. Do you want me to do them both, or which one would you like? Or you can choose one. We can start with one. I don't make it a choice. I don't make it a, do you want me to do this? I say, which one of these would you like me to do first?
Oh, I love that.
And then and some people don't want any help, right? Like they feel too, and they'll be like, oh, no, you don't have to. And I'm like, well, I want you to know, first of all, that I want to do this. And what I say all the time, I actually have a friend here that I've made in Florida. Her name is Crystal, and she's awesome. And I stayed with her kids for a weekend once, and I've done a few different things like that. Well, every time that I'm offering to help her, she feels guilty and doesn't want, she's like, you're too busy. I'm like, listen, I am very busy, but I'm figuring out what I can do in my schedule. But what I also say to her, and I've said this to many other people, is, do you like to help people? And almost everybody says yes. And I will say, how does it make you feel when you help people? And people will say, it makes you feel good. I'm like, then why don't you bless me by letting me feel good by helping you? I am offering to help, and this is something that I have figured out I can make work in my calendar and in my life. And so you would be blessing me by letting me do one of these things for you. And almost always then they're like, okay, you know what I mean? But we, in our society here in the US, we've got this go get them, do it yourself, don't need help mentality, which we know it's so funny because in our community, we'll say it takes a village, right? We'll say all of these things, but yet we still struggle to accept help. And we also struggle to ask for help. And so that's the other thing. So that's what I recommend for people that want to potentially help a family, is to give them like 2 or 3 concrete things, like whether it's, can I take one of your kids to an appointment? Can I take a kid out for dinner next week? Can I, there's the standard to bring you a meal. That's wonderful. You can always offer that. But usually those other things that, like for me, there was a couple of different years at different stages in Akila's life where I didn't feel safe taking her to doctor appointments by myself. And so I started having to go through my sister-in-law, my husband, one of my good friends. I started going through, I had this little rotation of people that I would have come with me on these appointments. So it could be that, there's lots of, I went and cleaned a person's house. I'm like, how about Saturday morning I come and do 2 hours of cleaning, right? So just giving tangible things that you can do that can help. But the other thing too, though, is we can also ask them, what are the hardest parts of your week or your day?
I love
and then
that question.
Listen to that family. And when they say it's driving them to all of these appointments, and say, okay, how about, can I take one of those appointments for you? Which may, what can I help with? And so finding out where those needs are. But on the flip side, we as the families with the challenges have to get better at asking for help.
Yes.
And asking specifically for help, and being okay with if people have to say no.
Right. I think I've faced those situations just like you're talking about from both angles. And one of the things that I have said to people in the past when they're like, but you're so busy and I don't want to put another burden on you. My response sometimes can be, yes, I hear you and I get that, but I have pretty good boundaries. And I can tell you that if I didn't have time for this, I wouldn't be offering. And so, we think about boundaries a lot of time as a thing you put up, but boundaries are things that we open as well. And so,
Absolutely.
we want to hold boundaries in certain areas, but we also want to open up those boundaries in others. And so, it is such a dance to offer help, to receive help, and all of that. But man, I can think of some of the richest experiences when people joined us in those really difficult spaces of growing up, our kids growing up, and also super blessed. I've been super blessed by stepping into some really hard spaces with people. So yeah, I love all those really practical tips. And yeah, I'm definitely not a fan of let me know, because it just feels overwhelming to have to, that's like a whole nother like category I've got to triage and think through and whatever. So I really love, how you're addressing that, have addressed that. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your faith has informed, this work for you.
My husband and I say this all the time. I don't know how we would have survived this without our faith.
Right. Totally.
It kind of is the place where we had to go in the really dark moments. And without that faith, I don't know that we would be doing as well as we are doing now, and that our kids would be doing as well as they were doing, because there were definitely moments where we were like, I literally don't know if we can keep going on right now the way that our family is. This is not safe. Like, it's not safe physically. It's not safe emotionally. And, if I hadn't had that faith system to be able to rely on, I don't know that we would have kept pushing. Because, one of the biggest struggles that we experienced, and that I see the majority of the families I work with experiencing, is navigating the system of care and getting the right support for our children, whether it's in the school system, in the therapeutic system, whatever, social service system it is very challenging to navigate in every single state. I just had somebody in a training I was doing last night ask me what state has better case management, for example. And I was like, well, actually the state you're in, but, it's because it's hard everywhere. And so literally, I can remember calling our county, front door service when we were on the brink of disaster, and encountered a very rude person who answered the phone. And I hung up the phone and I just started sobbing. And that is not a common thing for me. And I absolutely broke down. And 2 weeks later, after prayer, after, kind of just, my husband and I working it out, figuring out, I called the same number again, and a different person answered, and they were lovely and helpful. And so, but I might have just given up if I didn't have faith to keep on going, that things could get better. And things like that. It's easy to give up if you don't have faith to rely on.
It is, and there's so many angles of that. I really believe that a lot of our work with James Trail is to help remind all of us who are people of faith that Jesus is still in the business of healing. He's not. That's not just something that happened in the Bible. It is possible that it happens today. And so then people look at me and they say, yeah, but aren't you mad at God for all these hard things that have happened in your life? Like, heck yes. I mean, 100%. Like, I definitely have space, to feel those feelings. And I honestly believe that so does God. He's not nervous. He's not scared about my hard questions.
Right.
He's not upset that I get angry. And he's right there, ready to just like receive all of the things I need to wrestle with him about. And so I love that was a space that you've, found some healing and some, resilience from, because I definitely understand that.
Yeah.
So also kind of in this faith-based space, there's this really awesome conference that's coming up at the end of February called the Conference, Real Encouragement for Families. I am super excited. I'm going to get to go with a bunch of our team, and I know you're going to be a keynote speaker, and I'm excited about that.
No, it's, I had the good fortune to attend this conference last year and to present at it, and was very, very impressed with the conference. Jen Decker McMillan, I think that's her new name, is who coordinates it. And she is a wonderful, wonderful woman.
She is.
It's a great, so yeah, I'm actually doing the pre-conference, a full day training on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders as the
Love that.
pre-conference, but I believe that is sold out. And then I'm keynoting, I think on the first day of the conference, the title of my keynote is Humility, Humor, and Hope.
Ooh, I
And so,
love that.
yeah, it'll kind of be, I'll be talking about how when my husband and I went into this journey, we went into it with a lot of arrogance, being like, hey, man, I'm awesome with teenagers. And like, we've been babysitting nephews and nieces overnight, tons of experience with kids. This is going to be easy. We're going to love them. We're going to be strict and it's going to be awesome. And then it wasn't.
Yeah.
And we kept hitting the wall and smacking our heads against the wall. And so anyways, so I'll just be sharing, some of the arrogance that we went into it with and some of the hard lessons that we learned. I infuse it all with humor because I would say, other than my faith, the other thing that has helped both my husband and I survive some of the hard times was a sense of humor. And so I'll be sharing some pretty funny stories that have happened throughout our journey that mostly are ridiculous things my husband and I did. And then kind of ending it with hope and showing, talking about how once we've realized that we needed to parent differently, how behaviors decreased, relationships improved, as did the outcomes that our young adult kids are experiencing.
Well, that's exciting. So we'll have all the links for all the things, attached in the show notes for today's podcast. And if you are interested in, even looking at, recordings of that is also accessible online through the reconference. And I strongly encourage you to be a part.
I think some of it is on FaithBridge. The FaithBridge website.
Right, that's right. Absolutely. So we'll try to forward all of that stuff to our listeners. And is there anything else that you would love to talk about as we kind of begin to close out?
A couple of other things I'd like to throw in. One is I also do work in an FASD online coaching program that I'm the head coach. It's called FASD Success. FASDsuccess.com is the website of it. Jeff Noble developed this program, and it's a 6-month online group coaching program with a bunch of teaching and stuff like that. It's by far, if that program had existed when we were first figuring this stuff out, it's a game changer program. So I highly recommend people digging into that. You can always ask me questions, email me if you have questions about it. But really, the thing that helped when we were in the dark hole of despair, obviously our faith is what helped and being around other people who were like-minded, but really also finding our community, right? Finding community in other families who had similar children, were facing similar struggles. It was really those other families who I started to learn from. It wasn't, unfortunately, the professionals that were, most of the time, it wasn't the psychologist or the therapist or the doctor that were the ones that were giving us the advice that was helping us turn things around. It was other families who had lived through it. And so I can't, I can't impress upon us enough how important that is to find community. And that group coaching program has a huge sense of community, and it's from people from I think we have 12 different countries represented in it. But also at Families Rising, as my job as director of training, we provide training for states, counties, agencies, organizations, churches, all over the U.S. and Canada. And so we're always happy to provide training on FASD. My other area of specialty is raging, lying, and stealing.
Okay.
It's like in my resume, isn't that an odd thing to have as a specialty? But it's through lived experience of dealing with all of those behaviors and realizing how wrongly we were handling it, the way that most parents would handle it, the things we were saying and doing and the way we were responding. But none of those strategies were helpful. And when we figured out the new strategies, that was when the behavior started to decrease.
So many resources just in what you offer and what you've talked about today and in what we're going to include in the show notes. And so I guess Sadly, my last question to ask is, where are you finding beauty in this season?
For me, some of the beauty that I get to experience, we're in Florida here, so every time I take a walk, it's green and beautiful outside. But I do get to travel a lot for work. I'll be in Kansas in a couple of weeks. I was in South Dakota last week. I'm going to Boston and, DC, all over. And just like seeing the different seasons and different parts of the country and things like that is kind of where and then I love it when I get to go and visit a snowy place and leave. It's wonderful for me because I'm not a big fan of snow, but I like to visit it for a few days.
So creation is an inspiration for you there.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us. We definitely want to include the link on how they can grab your book. And I think that's going to be so exciting to have that as a resource coming this fall. And man, we are just super thankful for all that you've offered us today, and we'll continue through your resources. And Barb is just such a trusted expert in the field of trauma and mental health as it relates to kids, teenagers, and adults. So please lean in, listeners, to the resources that she provides. And man, we just appreciate you, Barb, so much.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith. I appreciate all the great work you're doing at James Trail for our families too.
Oh, it's a blessing to partner with awesome people like you and others that we're all joining together, right? So so thank you so much. And
thank
to our
you.
listeners, we will see you on the trail.